So as we get started, I do want to let you know we have a couple of different ways that you can engage with us today. First and foremost, please feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and thank you for the thumbs up. I see it. Awesome. You can also, if you'd like to, you'll see there's a QR code on the screen. That's actually to a link to ask your questions anonymously. So if you prefer not to do that in the chat, you can do it there. If you see me kind of looking to the left or right, that's just because I'm looking for questions as they come in. I promise I'm not trying to be rude. I just don't want to miss anything. But if you do have a question and I didn't get to it while we were chatting through, we do have some designated points to stop where I'll check in on those questions as well. With that being said, if there's something that I can't answer today, my promise to every one of my students is that if I don't have an answer today, I'll have an answer or a resource with the materials that go with this session. So that would be included for you if that comes up. And for today, we're going to be talking about a couple of different things. We're first going to just recap very briefly the 5 steps to effective budgeting, because that's largely part of what we're talking about in the context of the winter break. We'll also talk about some of the unique considerations that are involved in the budgeting process for the winter break and some of the opportunities that are out there. And we'll also talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available to you through iGrad. And if you haven't heard of iGrad, we'll touch on it a few times throughout this presentation, but it's a resource that's available to you as a student at Columbia University, both now and after you leave the school, by creating a free account using your email address with the @columbia.edu domain name. It's a lot to say. But when you do that, what's in there is a plethora of financial wellness and education related resources, with most of the resources there being used to build this presentation. That's something that's really important to me, that if I build it, I want you to know where I got the information from. So a lot of it comes directly from there. But for now, let's go ahead and actually get started with the meat and potatoes of our conversation today. So what exactly is financial wellness? Well, to understand that, we need to kind of think about our finances in a little bit more of an abstract way than we might usually, right? For most of us, our finances are really just kind of cold feeling. They're numbers, it's math, right? For some of us, that's just not the most fun thing in the world. And it certainly doesn't really ring the warm and fuzzy bell, right? It doesn't sound like wellness. However, if we look back to those 7 dimensions of well-being that Antonia shared with us earlier in the presentation, you'll see that we have our spiritual, emotional, intellectual, physical, social, environmental, and then all the way down at the bottom is financial, right? The little duck out. Now, if we think about our finances, we can very clearly understand how they might impact several of these other areas, right? Our finances can give us opportunities, which means we have the capacity to do what we really are hoping to do, which can be potentially a social conversation, or it could be something related to your emotional well-being, and certainly around the holidays in particular. When we're going home to go see our family over break, we have a lot of reinvented new social and environmental constructs, right? We're adults here at the university. When we go home, we may potentially be dealing with some family that we don't talk to all the time. And that can just get a little bit stressful as you get to be your own person, right? And we all have our own goals and our own paths. And, you know, family adds stress, but they also add fun. So it's just one of those ways that we want to be aware of our finances, because it can add to some of the other things that are already going on at a relatively difficult time. We're also approaching finals and things like that. So you want to make sure you're thinking of your finances in that capacity. So then what exactly is financial wellness? Well, if we wanted a literal definition, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau tells us that financial well-being is a state where you have control over your day-to-day and your month-to-month finances. You have the capacity to absorb a financial shock. You're on track to meet your financial goals, and you have the financial freedom to make the choices that allow you to enjoy life. And then that bullet point right there is where the warm fuzzy comes in, right? That really starts to feel like wellness, this idea of being prepared, yet still being able to do what you want to do today as well as tomorrow. Okay. Now, that's great. How do we do that? I wish we could just kind of take a little walk over to financial wellness lane and have it. We do need to do some work to get there. And that's where financial literacy comes in, your path to financial wellness. It encompasses a set of skills, including knowing when and how to find reliable information to make a financial decision, which I think is important. It doesn't say anywhere you need to memorize information, right? I can tell you, I haven't memorized all of the information that's available in relation to financial literacy and wellness. My goodness, I wish I could. The idea here is that you know where to go look for information, to go to the things that can be supportive to you in making your decisions. From there, it's also knowing how to process financial information to make sound financial decisions, right? So the information that we have is well vetted and we make good decisions as a result. And then knowing how to execute those financial decisions, adapting as necessary to stay on track. Okay, so putting them next to each other, we have financial literacy, which is knowing, and we have financial wellness, which is having. On the very bottom of this slide, we have the piece that bridges the gap, and that's the action component, right? It's one thing to know information about financial literacy. It's another to actually put your knowledge and your skills to use. It's a critical and really important piece of the puzzle when we talk about financial wellness. Some of the tools that you'll see today are meant to help you do that, so that you have some practical tools to actually put these ideas and in your knowledge and skills to good use. So then what exactly is iGrad? As I mentioned, iGrad is a free, first and foremost, free web-based financial literacy platform that's available to you now as well as after you leave the university. And as I mentioned, you can create your account very simply by going to columbia.igrad.com and signing up with your school email address, as easy as that. And what you'll find in there is a few different things. First, there's content that relates all the way from things you might be looking for today, like scholarship searches and things like that. There's also things that go all the way through the realm of personal finance to even estate planning, right? So from soup to nuts, you have information related to really almost any financial topic that you may have questions on in that platform. And they give it to you in a couple of different ways, right? If you're like me, there's a section where you can actually just go look at infographics. I like to kind of get the high level information first. And then, of course, pictures makes everything easier to look at least for me. But if you're more of a text-based type of person, there's content in there that's full articles that you can look through as well. And you might even use some of those smaller bullet points to then go bridge your conversation, right? Maybe I want to know a little bit about this and decide where to go next. And it also has a plethora of tools in there as well, some of which we will highlight today, but they're there so that you can use them for budgeting purposes, so you can use them for other financial planning considerations. And there's even a whole new section on money mindfulness, just this idea that our money is very much tied to the way that we experience wellness, and we need to be mindful about it. So I strongly encourage you, if you haven't taken a peek at the platform yet, go in and do so. It's well worth it. There's a ton of information there. You can go back to it at any time. And of course, you'll have my contact information with this presentation, so that if you have questions, you just let me know. If I can answer the question, I will. If not, I will go look for an answer. And that's always, again, my promise to everybody. So what exactly then, if we're trying to just think about what we're talking about today, getting ready for the winter break, we really need to get a better understanding of what our finances look like, right? And that's why we always talk about budgeting in this context. Now, we go through budgeting in a bit of a longer capacity in another presentation that we have. And in the materials, I'll link to it for you as well, so you can take a peek at it if you'd like to. But for today, we'll do a very brief recap so that you have the steps, and we can take a look at how we'll use that practically for the context of our session today. So what exactly is budgeting, right? Most of us are pretty aware. It's simple to just think of it as balancing your income and your expenses, right? However, that makes it seem very today, right? We want to make sure we're always thinking of our finances with that forward component that we talked about in the wellness conversation, right? So I like to kind of move away from using a budget to thinking about a spending plan, which really it just means that you're taking the information that you have today to make good decisions for today and start planning for tomorrow. Now, the actual steps we're going to talk about today are including needs and wants, just understanding what those are, understanding your income and expenses, defining and prioritizing your goals, developing a spending plan, and then really just sticking to it, okay? Which sounds kind of silly, but we go through a lot of work, and sometimes in the immediacy of things, it's not always the easiest thing to do, to stick to the promises we keep to ourselves, right? Now, today in particular, one of the really great opportunities we have is by going through this process, we'll do so again as an example for the winter break, right? Which means we're getting this opportunity to practice, right? Whenever we have that chance, we start to really improve our idea of self-efficacy. Once we succeed once, we know we can do it again, right? We go through this process and learn a little bit more each time that we do it, especially now when we think about it in the context of the winter break. And again, some of those things that could be additional stressors, our social status, our locus of control. Sometimes when things get a little hectic, it can feel like we don't have any locus of control. And when we start to get stressed, we lose some of those things like time orientation, impulsivity starts to come and creep up, and self-control, right? We want something now because we're stressed out. We want to have it. Well, that can be a little dangerous around the holidays, especially when we're talking about shopping. So with that said, let's talk about some of the information related to that. Now, first and foremost, the information that we have here today is actually being provided through most of the information in the course related to what's available on the screen. It's creating a financial plan for your priorities and goals. And this is indicative of one of the courses out of 26 total that are available in iGrad over a plethora of different courses. This is just to show you what's there, so you have an idea as to what these look like. They start off with customized content that they get by having you do a pre-assessment. This way you're getting information that matters to you, not to everybody. It's your information that's most important. There's course descriptions as well as an overview that tells you the type of content you'll have in the course. It also talks a little bit about the level of the course. They have introductory, intermediate, and advanced, depending on what you prefer in any given topic. And it talks about the learning objectives as well and gives you a course outline as you go. The best part is at the end, you actually get the opportunity to do a post assessment and see what your knowledge gains are, right? So from beginning to end, what you've actually learned through the course. It's a really nice way to motivate yourself to get through it. And you can take them over and over, and you don't have to necessarily do the whole thing at once. If you see that it's a little longer than you have, you can stop and go back to it, and it's still sitting there for you. Now, when we talk about needs and wants, right, this gets into the crux of really understanding who we are as people and what we actually want to do with our finances, right? Needs, very simply, is just basic things that are necessary for survival. However, when we talk about survival, that can be a really subjective term depending on where you are within the context of your finances, your life, and some of the choices that are available to you, right? For somebody that's really struggling financially, a need might be having sustenance, right? Having a place to live, things like that. However, if you're a little bit more comfortable with your finances, a need may be to do something that you've been hoping to do, or a need may be something that you're looking to do, like getting ready for the holidays, maybe having to buy gifts, right? That's important to you. So these are all things we need to think about within the context of our individual circumstances for that reason, and the way that we understand just the world around us, our values and how they influence that, our beliefs, and then how that's expressed in our attitudes and behaviors. They all kind of go together. So it makes it a little challenging sometimes to think about needs and wants. I don't know if you're anything like me. I've definitely stopped to look at something and thought, is this a need? And really struggled with the conversation that I was having, largely because maybe it is a need for where I am today, but maybe it isn't based on where I think I'll be tomorrow, so it's things to kind of keep in mind in that conversation. So after we figure out what needs are, right, we can then start to think about wants. The best thing about wants is that it means it's not a need today. If we want it, we can plan for it. And that means that we can actually transition into a goal, right? Something we can plan for. Now, the next piece of this is knowing your income and expenses, right? If we're going to talk about, how we can start to spend our money and some of the changes we might be able to make, it's important to know what's actually coming in and what's going out, right? For some of us, that might not be something we do regularly, is check in on that. One of the really great tools that's available to do that is what you're seeing here on the screen. This is IGRAD'S Daily Income and Expense Diary. And what it does is it gives you 30 days of a standard month to go ahead and track very simply money in versus money out across several different categories. So for example, let's say on day 1 of the month, that might be your payday, you would put the net amount of your income that came in. If on day 2, you have a utility bill, you put the amount that you pay in your utility bill, and so on and so on and so on throughout the month. And then after doing that, you get this really nice spreadsheet that shows you, 1, what you've actually spent in each category. So you have that literal information in front of you. And 2, a pie chart that shows you where the vast majority of your money went, right? So using the pie chart that's towards the middle of the screen here as an example, for this person, they have over 50% in their home expenses. Okay, that makes sense, right? For several people, especially in this area in the US, in New York City and the suburbs of, that's pretty common, right? So that's not really strange. However, if we looked at that and saw that that was all for fun expenses, awesome, that's great. I'm glad you have the capability to do it, but what could we be doing with those funds instead, right? We know we have to plan for the future, things like retirement and things like that. What are we actually doing with that money? If we're just sticking it in a savings account, do we have another option that might earn us a little bit more and help us get to another goal? So depending on the type of person you are, you've got a lot of data there to look at, but the whole point is that you're actually tracking it, right? You're going through the process of putting everything into this one place to see what's happening with your finances. Now, while this tool is designed for 30 days, you can choose a period of time to track that makes sense to you, right? You can also modify this so that if you're looking to do longer than 30 days or shorter, you don't have to do the whole month, or you can add another month to it. Really, it's going to depend on the way you prefer to think about your finances. For some of us, we like to think about it on a monthly structure because that's really when most of our bills are due. However, if you're relying on student aid, you might choose to do that over the period of, let's say, 4 months or 5 months to match with the term. This way you get an idea for what your expenses look like over time and then plan for that. For some of us, if we get paid biweekly, we would prefer to see it that way. Maybe that's the way we prefer to structure our payments, right? Really just depends on you. But you do have to look for some of those atypical things that can happen too, right? If we're tracking, sometimes it might be a period of time where there's some either financial windfalls, which is money that's coming into us that we didn't expect, or vice versa. We have some increased expenses that weren't typical. It doesn't mean we don't need to be aware and account for them, but it means that you're not typically going to have it in your budget. So you want to be thinking about where it normally would fall as you plan, right? And then after you've done that, the next piece is actually to look at it, right? It's actually going through and seeing what happened. A really great example, again, using that housing discussion is if you go through and see there's a bunch of extra money, what can we do with it, right? What do I have going on? Do I have time to start planning for a goal, right? Now, on the other side of that, if you go through and see that maybe you're struggling in an area, if something happened that didn't really go the way that you wanted it to, we can think about why. And is there something that we see in our budget that might potentially be helpful to us in that conversation? Sometimes we're having trouble in one area, but maybe we're doing really, really well in another. What can I learn from that in transitioning over? So this is, again, just the idea that you want to have an awareness of where your funds are going, and actually tracking it makes a big difference. It's not all that different, but when you go into dieting conversations, we tell you to actually write it down because you don't realize where everything's going. This is the exact same idea. It's just with your finances. Now, once we can see what our resources look like, we can then actually start moving forward, right? We can start planning for some of those wants or those goals that we talked about earlier. First and foremost, we have to make sure our current needs are met, right? That always has to happen first. But assuming we have some additional resources available, we can actually start setting some goals and prioritizing them, right? We want to think about the one that's most important to us that we want to achieve first. Start with figuring out what that goal is, and then write it down and start planning for it. What do we need to do to get there? And there's a few ways you can do that. I like to use a funnel method. I start with the main idea of my goal at the top, and then I fill in the details going down, largely because I tend to miss some of the details. I find writing it out like that is very helpful for me. For other people, and this is another method I also use, they use what's called SMART goal setting, which, if you haven't heard of it, is just an acronym for setting a SMART goal. Really simply, it's specific, it's measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based, okay? These are all important metrics with goals, largely because if they don't exist, you're at risk for never achieving that particular goal, right? If it's not specific, you're never gonna know exactly what you need to do to get there, right? It's one thing to say, I wanna go on vacation. It's another to say, I wanna go on vacation in Hawaii in December for a week with so-and-so and at this time. It's a very, very different thing. Measurable kind of goes along with the whole time-based component, right? It just means that we need to be able to track progress, right? In order to track progress, we also need to have a deadline, and that's where that time-based piece comes in as well. These things can change, right? As you're measuring, you may need to adjust your timeline, right? That's how we know that that's the case, but we don't want to not put a deadline on there just because a deadline is what makes us actually make progress toward it. If it's not important enough to have a deadline, it's never going to be important enough to finish. Attainable, this is kind of why we need to look at our finances first, right? We don't want to set up a goal that there's absolutely no way we can achieve. So knowing what your resources are really important. And then relevant. Relevant is an interesting one because we would think if we're setting the goal, it's got to be relevant to us, right? However, there's so many different influences around us that it's really easy to kind of get those influences into our own projection of the goals that we're trying to achieve. And certainly around times where we're maybe visiting family again, there's also that pressure of making sure that you're doing what they want and making everybody happy, right? If it's important to you, you'll be much more apt to achieve the goal. If you don't find it to be terribly important to yourself, the likelihood is you're not going to put a lot of effort toward it, okay? And as far as planning these, you do want to make sure, again, with that time-based component, you have a time frame in mind. In general, we would typically say that a short-term goal is something you plan to do in about a week to 6 months, where an intermediate goal would be about 6 months to a year. And then long-term would be something greater than a year. Really great example of that would be retirement. It's one of those things we don't always think about, but it's a bit longer than a year away for most of us, and it is something we need to plan for. So it's a good example there. For now, we're really talking about short-term, right? If we're talking about the holidays, it means we need to be able to get where we're going or not get where we're going. And it means that we need to be able to do some purchases if we plan to do that. So we're looking more at the short-term goal timeframe here. Now, next, we need to make a spending plan, okay? Now, the spending plan is very similar to the idea of our budget before, right? Except we're gonna go ahead and start integrating some of those forward-moving things that we discussed, right? Those goals that we have and where we think things are going to be going in the future. To do that, you want to estimate your expenses as well as your income. In the context of what we're doing today, that means looking at the information that's available historically, right? You want to use good information to do that. And using that information, you start developing your spending plan, making sure that you have your goals all laid out the way that you want them to, and you're actually planning with the resources that you have. And then we need to go ahead and evaluate the results. Before we do that, though, I did want to point out one of the really great tools that can be helpful in this capacity that's available in iGrad. This is their Your Budget tool. And rather than it being a static type of like Excel worksheet or Google Sheet, like we saw earlier, this is a bit more dynamic. What it does is it allows you to enter very much the same data, and this is all your data that does not get shared with anybody else. It's just that it's in the platform for you and you alone, okay? And it allows you to, if you'd like, to actually integrate your goals directly into this budget. So at the very bottom of the budgeting section, you can go ahead and say, I'm going to add a goal. You put exactly how much you need to put away. You put your time frame in there. You put how much you've already put away, and it'll immediately adjust your budget, which is really an easy way to do this. Because if you look kind of towards the middle left side of the screen, you'll see there's that budget status section where it says monthly net and it's green. That means it's positive. That means there's money left over. And if we were to change something like add that goal and it went into the red, we're now in negative. We know that we need to adjust something else in order to make that goal happen. So instead of having to figure out all this math, you can kind of work in one place. It'll let you also slide different expenses up and down as far as the percentage of what your total expenditures are. So let's say you're in a position where you may be moving, right? And you know you're going to be moving to a lower cost area. You can use that to kind of adjust your expenditure for your housing expense down a little bit and see what that does to your budget. So you have ideas about where your finances will go. So this is a really fantastic tool for doing things like that if you like the idea of having something that's real time and easy to manipulate. Now, the last piece of that step process is actually sticking to it. And as I alluded to earlier, at least for me, this is one of the hardest parts of this process, right? You go through all of this work to do this evaluation, to understand where your finances are, to really get a feel for kind of what is most important to you and where you're hoping to set some goals. And then you have to keep the promise you made to yourself and actually do what you said you were going to do, right? Now, in order to do that, again, we have to evaluate. We have to ask ourselves some questions. How well did we stick to the plan? Did we struggle? Did we succeed? And where and why? You know, what can I learn through this process? Do I have to make changes or can I make changes? Again, do I have some extra finances? What can I do with that? Or if I don't, what do I have to change? And then, were you reasonable in creating your goals? This is really important, especially in the context of our conversation today, right? If you have a goal that you need a certain amount of funding for, you know, holiday gift giving being a great example, were we reasonable in setting the information aside that we need to do that and actually making sure we could get to that goal? If we didn't go through the process of really figuring out what we need to do to get there, we very likely aren't going to meet it, right? And by asking yourself these questions, you have the capability to really see what things can put you off track, the stimuli that can set you off, right? Around the holidays, the fact that we may be out and shopping a lot in particular could be something that is a trigger for some people in the financial context. There's a lot of things out there. Maybe you want something for you because you're shopping, right? Or maybe we're going to just get things for family. So this will help you be aware of where you may be struggling in that area. If you saw in a previous assessment that maybe you went over on some of those fun expenses, you can take a look at maybe why that happened and be prepared for it on the next go around. And that's ultimately how you start controlling the decisions that you make and how you respond to certain situations, and then respectively, the consequences of your actions, right? And all of that leads to better control over your money. More important than anything though, this is a cycle, right? This isn't something that's meant to be, you know, a negative experience. It's tough to look at our finances, but you want to focus on the wins, right? We're not ever failing at this process. We're learning in this process. And every time we go through it, we learn a little bit more and we can take that information and adjust as need be. It's all about building that self-discipline so you can really see how well you're doing in this process, and then self-reflecting and knowing that just by making changes, you're still doing a good job, right? The fact that you made changes means you recognize the need. It's a positive. Now, another really good tool that's available in iGrad that I think is really the unsung hero of the platform, truly and honestly, this is their money personality tool. And what it is a couple of just personality-based questions, nothing really difficult, related to you, right? And in answering those questions, you get about a 40-page booklet that has information related to how you may engage with your finances over several different areas. You're actually seeing a snapshot of mine on the screen. And this in particular is talking a little bit about the emotional aspect of how I engage with finances, right? And I was told that I'm a bit relaxed, which is 100% true. I'm generally a very relaxed person. The best part is it doesn't just tell you how that's, potentially a negative, right? Instead, it talks about where you may have some really big strengths in context to that, and where you may have some challenges, right? And by knowing where those are, some of the action items that you might put into practice as a result. So as somebody that's a bit relaxed, one of the things that came up on the challenge section was that I could be a little susceptible to, impulse purchases. 100% true. Definitely can. I'm one of those people that prefer to shop for myself on accident when I'm doing holiday shopping. I try not to, and this is ultimately how I do it. One of their recommendations was slow down and take a beat before you buy, right? Using online shopping as an example, this to me sounded just like putting something in your cart and then forgetting that it's there. So you still kind of go through that experience of shopping. However, by the time you get to the cart, if you're not going to receive that item in 2 days anyway, you have time to wait to get it. It's got some time for shipping to happen. So I put it in the cart, I wait 2 days, I go back to it. And if I don't remember why I put it there, or I don't necessarily need it anymore, and I've been able to solve, whatever reason I was purchasing it, some resolution there, then I can take it out of the cart and I didn't actually spend the money. So you can see that there's really tangible items here you can use so that you can just better understand how you engage with your finances, especially if you're having trouble understanding, one, what's most important to you, or two, why some of the decisions that you're making are having the influence that they are. All right, so with that said, I'm going to pause to see if we had any questions. I don't see that we did, but good news, you can always ask them. Please feel free if they come up. We'll keep going for now, though. All right, so let's take this into the context of the winter break, right? We want to make sure we're thinking about a couple of different things. And these are all things we talked about in the budgeting process, but we want to start putting them through the lens of this particular moment in time for the holidays and the winter break. And I did see that we wanted to go back to the QR code slide, so we can do that for just a moment to make sure that you have it. Thank you for asking. As we're doing that, what we're going to talk about a little bit here as far as some of the questions we'll ask is, what resources do we have and where and how do we prioritize and decide to allocate them? How do we identify what we need to do and what we want to do and what we're expected to do? That's that family influence that can happen. And then plan for those and decide what we'll actually pursue and what we won't. From there, you're very welcome, by the way. I'm happy to share it. We're then going to go ahead and lay out our finances in context with what we've just discovered, right? We found out what we hope to do, plan to do, need to do, or expected to do. And then we want to look at the resources that we have to actually do it, okay? And we want to do that in keeping two facets in mind, right? Again, we always want to go back to that historical information so that we're making good decisions. And then from there, we want to evaluate if our plan actually is meeting our needs and adjust if need be, right? So as we move forward, there's actually an example of what that looks like coming up. So for this example, right, we're going to talk a little bit about Isabella and what she's hoping to do over her winter break, okay? Isabella's family lives in Jacksonville, Florida, and she plans to stay with them for 2 weeks or so. And they host a holiday dinner where they have a white elephant gift exchange, which if you're not familiar with that is just a way of kind of exchanging gifts so that you're really only ever buying one gift. It starts off with people, bringing a wrap present. Everybody pulls a number out of a hat that brought a wrap present. The person that's pulled number one goes through and grabs a gift, opens it up, sits on the lap. And then person two goes, they grab a gift. Before unwrapping it, they decide if they want to take person one's gift or keep the gift that they have now and open it. And that goes on and on and on through all the numbers. And then at the tail end of it, number one gets to go again because they kind of got stuck with the short end of the stick at the beginning of the conversation. It's a really fun kind of way to approach holiday gift giving. Now, She also plans to visit and exchange gifts with a brother who's married but doesn't have any children. Okay, so that's important to know who we're buying for, right? She also has a sister that has 2 primary school age children, younger kids, and 2 of her best friends from high school, who she also plans to go to dinner with while she is, over for the holidays, and buy gifts for them as an exchange. And she's also going to be doing an overnight trip with her friends for New Year's Eve. So we now know exactly what she's hoping to do and what the plans should be. Right? Now we need to understand what money is available for Isabella to do this, right? So this is a snapshot of another tool that's available in iGrad. It goes along with the daily income and expense diary. This is actually the spending plan that they have available to you, right? It lets you go through and do kind of the same thing we did on the daily basis earlier on a monthly basis. So you put down what you anticipate you'll be spending, and then later on you fill in what you did spend, and you can see where things may need to potentially adjust, just like we did before. And you have a span of 12 months in which you can do that. And at the end, you get an annual assessment. So it just takes that whole idea of that monthly concept and takes it full through to a year. Now, in her case, first, we can see she's got some utilities, groceries, toiletries. Those are things that we expect to be in her budget, right? That makes sense. Those are all things that we need to take care of. She also has a few other things listed here, quite literally under the other categories throughout this particular tool, right? She also lists a few things that have some questions as well, like dining and going out and clothes. Are those things that we have to do, or are they things that we can adjust for, given that we have some other plans, right? She has auto insurance listed there, but there's nothing listed in the car transportation section as far as like fuel or car maintenance or anything like that. So I'd be curious to know what that was as well. And we can also see that she has some other things she's working on, right? She does have a credit card and she's making payments toward that. We know that that can't change. That has to stay the way that it is. She's also working on an emergency fund, and she's working toward her next vacation. So this starts getting into that value-based conversation, right? An emergency fund is really important. We never want to recommend, if you can avoid, making changes there, doing that. But things like your next vacation, I don't know what that vacation is. I don't know what her time frame is just yet. And I don't know, how important that is to her. Vacations can be, a personal decision depending on what they're being, used for. Is it just a chance to relax, or are we celebrating, right? So from here, we then can see we don't have any gifts listed in here, right? So we know we need to plan for those. And her net income minus expenses right now leaves us $288. So that's the amount of money that she currently has available, not in use in her spending plan, right? Now, as we go forward, we can see here her gifting needs, right? Isabella has a total of 10 gifts that she needs to purchase and historically spends about $50 on each person she buys for, plus a little bit more spending on her niece and nephew, right? The younger kids, that tends to happen. She also needs to think about getting to Florida, right? She needs some accommodations while she's there and travel. She indicates that she's going to be staying with friends at a beach house for the party that they're having for New Year's Eve, and she's allocated a portion of her fun expenses to those costs, so she can buy groceries while she's there, right? Bring in some food for everybody, that kind of thing. It's a party that everyone's bringing things to. She goes to price out airfare, and she does so with her preferred travel dates between 12/24 and 1/8. And she sees that the base rate she found for a round trip each way was $350. Okay. So by adding that into the amount that she had left, we're over what we have available in our funding for this particular time period. That means we need to go through and figure out where we can adjust, right? If we had gotten to a point where we didn't need to change anything, awesome. Fantastic. But now we know that we need to make some changes. What are we going to do that? Now, in looking through some of the spending that she actually has, Isabella spends about $250 a month on groceries, $75 on toiletries, and $125 on utilities. And she got those values from evaluating her prior budgets and spending plans to today, right? Looking at some old receipts and just seeing what's happened just historically, excuse me. The dining and going out that we had questions on, right? It represents the amount that she plans to spend at the dinner or gift exchange with her friends, right? She's looking to go out and have a nice time with them. And the overnight stay for her New Year's Eve plans, as we talked a little bit about before. As far as clothes go, she had gone through her summer clothing and she realized there's just some things that she needs to replace. Keeping in mind, it's pretty cool here on the East Coast right now for New York. Florida's going to be a little different. In order to actually be there, it's not odd for her to need things like sandals or shorts, things like that. So that's important, right? And as far as giving, she had something listed in the giving section. She donates to her local animal shelter each year to assist with caring for untold animals over the holidays. So that's another value-based consideration that we have to have there. How important is that to this person? Now, some of the questions we had related to the car, right? For the auto insurance side of things, we find out that Isabella currently has a car at home that her parents house in their garage. She doesn't have any debt on it. That's why there's no payment listed there. And it's in pretty good shape with low mileage, but it's her first car and approaching 15 years old. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. We're in Manhattan right now. Most of us are in Manhattan if you're not around the world. The vast majority of us are probably not going to need a car at school, right? Now, on the other conversation, those other categories that were listed there, for $50, she purchased new electronics and charging cables for her laptop and her phone. She needs to be able to turn those on. The 127 that was listed all by its lonesome, that's very clearly, we all know what that is. That is the MTA pass, right? That's our transit pass. That's the monthly amount. And then $40 for streaming services and subscription fees, right? Things like your streaming services and other content that you might be getting like that. For the emergency fund, she started putting away money in that fund at the beginning of the semester, just to have something for unexpected expenses, which is very smart. And she hopes to have $3,000 by the start of her final semester in fall 2023. And again, this is something that she's working on. That's important. You want to have that backup available. As far as the next vacation goes, Isabella's planning to gift herself a vacation after she graduates at the end of the fall 2023 term, right? So now we have the time period in which she's hoping to achieve it. And we know that this is important to her, right? This is something that she's looking to do as a reward for herself. So it's not something we necessarily want to tell her to say, no, just don't do that anymore, because that can be a detriment and really make the experience of going through this process kind of negative, and you don't want to do that. Now, what else can we potentially adjust, right? If we look at our groceries, toiletries, and utilities, we can actually make some changes here, right? We're not going to be here for 2 weeks, some of it in January, some of it in December. So she went through and was able to make some adjustments related to what her expenses will actually be, doing the math, kind of dividing everything by the number of days in the month and coming out with an amount in total. And she was able to adjust her December cost to $101.64 instead of the $250 that had been there before. We talked about the value-based considerations that she has. We'll get through those in just a few moments. And on the travel side of it, she actually went through to figure out, do I really need a monthly pass for December and for January, right? If I'm not going to be here for a chunk of the month in each one of those months, is that the best way to go? Well, in her case, she found it was a little less expensive to go with, with less monthly passes and going with like weekly passes or, the 10-day pass that exists. It wound up being more appropriate given the number of trips that she usually takes. It looks like she's taking kind of on a daily basis, 2 trips per day, and the costs are listed there as well. Now, with that being said, we just said, she took the combination of weekly and daily passes. She took advantage of that because that reduced her overall costs. It wasn't going to be as expensive. She also found out that there's a classmate that's relatively, that she's relatively comfortable with, someone she's close to, and they're going to be carpooling with 2 other people, and then with Isabella would be 4 people total, for about $65, everybody contributing to get where they need to go, okay? Now, we remember the airfare was $350 each way, kind of expensive, and those numbers, the last I looked, that was from last year, so this is probably even a little more so now, but that's a significant reduction from that cost, right? Just having the capability to carpool with somebody makes a big difference. Her parents live about 25 miles from the airport, which is where they're going to drop her off as far as the carpooling goes. And they're happy to pick her up. And she also was able to find a much less expensive flight going one way on the way home, right? Instead, she's got $99 for that one flight. And that's not all that strange. Sometimes those one-way flights can be a little bit less expensive than trying to buy the round trip. So that's just a tip to try and help on that front. And as we mentioned earlier, she was able to reduce some of those, other expenses like groceries, toiletries, utilities, because she'll actually be away for those periods and be with family at the time who is going to be assisting with that end of things for her. Now, on the value-based side of things, right, this is where it gets a little bit more gray. This is where we talk about need and the subjectivity that goes with it. Isabella isn't willing to compromise her emergency savings or her vacation fund, right? Those are too important for her. She doesn't want to change it. But she will reduce her donation, right, to that animal shelter. And instead, she's going to supplement it by volunteering her time. So that's a really great tip for kind of saving, yet still doing the things that are important to you. This is a charitable organization she feels close to, obviously, and she doesn't want to not do something for them during this time of year when she has the capability to and she's home, right? So instead, she decides to put some of her time to use. And she doesn't have plans for every day that she's going to be there. She was able to do that. Isabella and her friends decide to forego gifts and dinner since they're all going to be at the holiday dinner at her family's house anyway. So they were able to eliminate some gifts that they need to buy, which is awesome. And they're still participating and still seeing each other, right? Instead, they're also going to schedule a potluck so they can all get together later a little bit more intimately instead of it just being the party at her family's house. That can be a little difficult. And it's a nice way for them to actually sit down and chat without spending a bunch of money, right? They're still getting the same experience of being in a restaurant together. It's not being out, but the important part is seeing each other and talking with each other. And that you don't see the people at home very often once we start being away for school. Now, lastly, Isabella decides it's time to sell her car if she doesn't expect to need it post-graduation, which her family offers to assist her with. She prices it fairly and manages to sell it for $1,500. Now, this is a one-time consideration, obviously. We're not always going to have a car at the end of the year that we can sell. However, it's about recognizing some of the things that we can change, right? So she's paying for this car insurance. She doesn't expect to need this car ever again. It's just sitting there, and she was able to actually make some meaningful changes by selling it. So what did that ultimately do for us, right? Now that we look and see the adjusted amount of her travel costs, the adjusted amount of what she needs to buy in gifts, and some of the other adjustments for the sale of the car and all of those things, we now have a surplus with the gifts included of $1,696.50, right? So that is significant. Of course, $1,500 of that is the car, but even if we took that out, she'd still have a positive after adding all of those gifts into the conversation, right? So this is just to kind of illustrate that you can go through this process very tactically, sitting down and looking at what's available to you to make changes if need be for individual circumstances. And of course, you can do this on the long term as well. This is exactly what you would do as you were going through this for your overall spending plan. Now, with that said, I don't see that we've had any other questions pop through, so I'm going to go ahead and push forward. With that being said, let's go ahead. From here, we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between time and money, okay? Now, the reason I like to talk about this in the context of our plans over the winter break is because we're at a point where there could be some really interesting things happening, like financial windfalls, right? For some of us around the holidays, we get some funding coming in, maybe grandma writes a check, that kind of thing. There's the opportunity for us to be subject to something called mental accounting bias, right? The idea being whenever we have a financial windfall, things like an income tax return, maybe we're getting a refund or sales of an asset like the car, it's really easy to contextualize that as a different type of money than the money that we do with our regular budgeting because you didn't expect to have it, right? It's brand new. Why would I apply this to the budget that I have? I can just use this for what I want to use it for. That's what that mental accounting bias is, right? And it can cause, significant cognitive errors, right? One really good example would be, deciding where to put the money once you have it as well. Do you decide you want to pay off a credit card or maybe invest? That's a question we get a lot from students as well. So it's about sitting down and actually looking at the funding that's there and making decisions that make sense in that context. What can I do with this that's going to be the most helpful to me in the long run? We also want to think about that time value of money, which very simply, all that is that the concept of a sum of money is worth more now than that sum of money would be in the future, okay? And the reason for that is money that we have now, we can use now, right? So we want to make sure we understand that time can be a play in this conversation as well. Whatever we do with it, is it the right answer for us today and tomorrow, given that that value changes over time? And to articulate that, I wanted to share an example of just a really two different circumstances related to saving, right? We have two different individuals here. Both are 20 years old at the time, and they're starting to set aside money at $50 and $150 a month. And for this particular practice, we're going to say they're doing that in an investment vehicle that's going to result in a 5% return, something that grows at 5%, right? If we look at those numbers, we can see that over each 10-year increment, the amount that $50 and $150 turns into is significantly different, right? After just 10 years, $50 a month with no extra addition beyond what is already earning an interest, we now have $7,750. Where on the other side of that, putting away $150, we've got $23,249, right? And that's just based on one monthly contribution over and over and over. And we keep evaluating after each 10-year increment until we get to 70 years old, right? At which time we now have $128, $985,000 for the person that's putting in $50 a month. And we have $300,086,956 for the person putting in $150. So this is the importance of time in relation to your money. And I like bringing it up again, because when we have financial windfalls, if there's anything extra laying around, we have the chance to make a choice of what to do with it. It's important to know what can happen with our money in each option that's available to us. One of the other tools that's available to help on that front, and as I mentioned before, we get a lot of questions related to this, is whether or not we want to pay down a debt or invest when we have a financial windfall like that, or if we have extra money in the budget. This tool, IGRAD'S Pay Down Debt or Invest Calculator, will help you better understand what may be the better option for you, right? It'll ask you for the interest rate on your debt, as well as what you may potentially be earning on any investment avenue that you're pursuing, and some questions related to whether it's taxable in your tax bracket. And it does have information that'll better explain how you can determine that information as well. And at the tail end of it, you get a result that lets you know kind of how much in interest you'll be, paying over time, and what the investment return would be on the other side of it, right? You can use that to decide where that benefit could be. If you see that you're going to put way more in interest on that debt that you have than you would get in returns, you might choose to pay the debt, or vice versa if the information is the other way. Now, just a few common expenses that you'll see when we're talking about this time of year, right? Booking flights, travel is definitely one of them. If you can, try and book them early. Really important, just because the sooner you book, the closer you get to the date that you need to travel, the more expensive it usually is. Red-eye flights can sometimes be a way to kind of reduce some of your costs. Not that anybody wants to take some red-eye flights, it's not the most fun thing in the world. However, it is an option for you and can be a little less expensive. Pack light. Adding luggage to your trip just means you're likely paying for checked bags. Okay. So with that being said, you can certainly try and potentially ship your gifts, right? That's an idea for reducing those costs if it's at all possible for you. Sometimes it's a little less to ship it directly than to actually try and get it on the plane with you. And then use privacy and incognito browsers, right? Unfortunately, the airlines are relatively aware that once you look at the site, you might go back to look at it again. If you're using the incognito browser, you have the likelihood of them not remembering through your cache that you had been there, and the chance to get kind of the first offer that they might provide. With that said, I did see we had a question come through asking to go back to the slide with the tool for pay down or invest. So I'll do that momentarily. And again, the idea here, if you're looking at it, is you're basically putting in information related to what you know about your potential investment options, as well as what you know about the debts that you have, including the interest rates and some other tax-related information that they can help clarify for you. As you're going through, you'll see those little question boxes next to those fields. They can help you understand what those are supposed to be as far as the answers that you might provide. And in doing that, we'll see there's two different columns on the other side. We have our after-tax cost of debt, that's 17% that's there. And we also have our after-tax investment return, which in this case was 0, because the interest rate that they could potentially earn was 0.01% on the left-hand side, right? That's very likely just your typical savings account. It's not very high as far as what you'd get on a rate of return. In this case, we can see that the amount of interest that's being incurred far outweighs the amount of, the after-tax investment return. So this person might choose then to put the extra money that they have towards their debt to try and bring that down first. Now, as far as gift giving and holiday expenses, you want to try and shop with a list and keep it, nearby. Just not having things written down sometimes can really make it easy to go off track. You want to be aware of your spending habits. I know for me, I tend to have a hard time with credit cards in that it doesn't feel like real money. When you hand it to somebody, it's just swiping gone, swiping gone, swiping gone. So highly recommend that if that's a little bit of a problem for you, keep the list and keep the costs in mind, right? You could potentially use cash as long as you're comfortable carrying that cash. We never want somebody to be, carrying a ton of cash around, and that might not be safe. Look for any options that are available to you related to deals, coupons, membership points, rewards programs, all of that fun stuff. Sometimes they do have some really helpful ways to reduce your costs. And of course, my favorite, give experiences instead of gifts, or personalized gifts. Group gift giving is one way to do things. My family will often do that. You'll give something to the family instead of just, one person gets a gift. It gets to be a lot when you're all adults. Also consider sharing time rather than money. One of the things that Isabella did was decide to volunteer, right? Well, maybe her friends want to come and do that with her. That can be a really nice experience to have. I see that we had a comment come through. I have a really tough time tracking cash spending when I have it, either taking out from checking or friends returning money. Do you have any tips for keeping track of cash spending? Yeah, that is a great question. So when we're talking about spending on your cash end of things, what you might choose to use is that daily income and expense tracker, right? What that will do is it'll first and foremost show you where that money is going, right? As you start seeing it go out. And then, with it, you can use whether it's another spreadsheet or something like that, just keeping track of who owes you what in that capacity. That can definitely be something that's helpful. The other thing you might choose to do is in IGRAD'S money mindfulness section. I like kind of using that in conjunction with the income daily and the daily income and expense tracker because it's got a section where you can do some journaling, right? And it saves it there for you. So if you've gone through the process of, trying to recoup some money, you can keep track of that there so that you're aware of it and you'll know exactly the last time you tried to go through the process of either getting money back for somebody or what you've spent on who, and go through that process that way in conjunction with the income and expense diary and the budget tools that are there. So those could be two really helpful ways of doing that. As far as this examples of family or group gifts, some of the things that you can do is like gift maybe experiences, right? It's certainly things like a gift card to go to a nice dinner if you're talking about a couple, or even, an overnight stay for family to some type of, park or something like that. I'm thinking about, I can't remember the name of it, but there's definitely a park in Pennsylvania. It's like a water park that you can go to like for a day or two with your kids if you wanted to do that. One of the things that my mom is actually doing this year, which I thought was really sweet. I don't have kids, but I have birds. Okay. I have two of them, two parrots. I love them to death. They're like little toddlers and they get gifts for Christmas. So for us, instead of buying gifts for each other, we decided that we're going to gift to our pets this year instead, because none of us have kids, but we all have pets. So she's going to be making gifts for my pets. And ultimately, that's a group gift. I get to watch them destroy everything she makes because that's what birds do. So that's just an example of things that you might do in that circumstance as well. I've also seen people do things, like baskets, things like that. But I think something personal that you're aware of in relation to the group that you're buying for is probably the best way to go. Now, some other ways to save and earn, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I know we're short on time and I want to be mindful of that for everybody. Organize group volunteering versus holiday parties. That's something we mentioned just a few moments ago. Do your winter cleaning. When I say winter cleaning, it's kind of twofold, right? First, I know for me, this is the time of year that I go through and start getting ready to donate things like, clothes that are no longer worthwhile, things like that. That does two things. One, you may potentially get a return on that, depending on the way you're doing it. Certainly in the context of, putting it in a consignment shop, or if ultimately you decide to do it as a traditional investment, charitable, drop-off type of thing, potentially, some benefit there as well. You take the time to analyze what's gone on over the last semester, okay? See what you can do to potentially make your budget a little bit better. You have the time to do that. Look at doing some upskilling, learn a new skill, or, see if you're going to be around for the holidays, looking for some short-term options as far as maybe filling in for someone as they're not around for the holidays, right? And you want to make sure you try and keep away from boredom, because boredom is definitely an easy way to start spending when you didn't plan to. With that being said, I always recommend looking for scholarships around this time of year as well. New year, new opportunities. And iGrad has a fantastic scholarship search engine available to do that. When you create your account, you can use this to get there. And ultimately, it lets you go through and search opportunities with several different criteria in one place. So that can be, for example, U.S. citizenship status. If you're not a citizen, it'll let you choose the fact that you do not want options that it's required that you are a citizen or permanent resident. You can do it by grade level or institution type for graduate students, for example, versus undergraduate students. And it lets you save, filter and sort the information that's available to you throughout the entirety of the options you can search through. For example, you can go ahead and put a certain amount that you're hoping to search for. You can go ahead and put, if you want kind of the ones that are ending soonest to be popped up first, so you can prioritize accordingly. And as you open up each individual opportunity, okay, you have the chance to actually see each specific piece of information that's related to that scholarship. You don't have to go to each individual website to do it before you decide to apply. iGrad actually goes through the process of vetting these and keeping them current, so you know that the information is trustworthy and relatively accurate. And you can open it up right from there if you want to go apply and go, and it'll have you do that. And we have a really nice walkthrough video available that'll be linked in the resources for you on how you can go through that process. And I do see that we had another question come through. Would group gifts cost ultimately the same as an individual gift? So there are some instances where that could happen, but that's part of going through the process of going through and budgeting, right? If you go through and see what you would potentially do for an individual gift for somebody, or vice versa for that group gift, and see that it's about equitable, think about what is going to be the most beneficial for that person or the family that you're buying for, so that you're spending, the way that you want to. But group gifts do potentially offer the chance to kind of reduce some costs if you can find something that makes sense for everybody, without it being exuberant in cost, if that makes sense. Now, lastly, I do want to share some resources with you. This is related to information about different types of non-repayable fund sources. You're going to have information on how you can, one, see what they are, and two, a supplement to it on where you can look for some of those opportunities as well beyond what we have in IGRAD. And lastly, I wanted to just say thank you for being here. I know that this is a lot of information, but this time of year can be challenging, and we want to make sure that our students, have options and a place to ask questions and get some ideas for how you can move forward and get prepared for the new year in a good way. On this slide, you'll see there's a QR code to the left. That is actually a walkthrough video for iGrad. It's got chapters. You can see exactly how to use the platform, and go from there. So if you're a little, uncomfortable or just haven't had a chance to do that relatively recently, you can get an idea of how to work through it. You'll also have my contact information so that if you have any questions, you can absolutely reach out. And that includes, whether or not it's a content related question, what we talked about today, or something in the iGrad platform. Go ahead and reach out, let me know. I'm happy to assist where I can. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and throw it on back to Antonia and wrap us up for the day.
Great. Thank you so much, Trista. That was wonderful. Thank you all so much for your really great questions. You're all going to get this recording sent to you in your email, as well as any other information we may have for you. Thank you so much. Have a great week and holiday break. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.